In the sweltering heat of 1944, America's top fighter pilots in the Pacific were given an order that sounded like suicide: to fly their P-38 Lightnings in a way that every manual, every instructor, and every instinct they had screamed would blow their engines clean out of the sky. But the man giving the orders wasn't a general. He was a 42-year-old civilian they weren't even sure they could trust. That man, standing quietly in the doorway of a makeshift rec hall in Dutch New Guinea, had interrupted a checkers game between two of the Army Air Force's finest. The group commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, was a 26-year-old ace with 10 victories to his name. He was a man who understood risk, but this was different. The civilian introduced himself with a name that was once the most famous in America, a name that had become tangled in controversy: Charles Lindbergh. Yes, that Charles Lindbergh, the hero who conquered the Atlantic, now a man without a uniform, asking to teach combat veterans how to fly. What no one knew that day was that this quiet conversation would change everything. It would spark a revolution in the air, a clash between military doctrine and one man's hard-won genius. Because Lindbergh was about to show these pilots a secret, a counterintuitive trick that would nearly double the range of their fighters, turning the P-38 from a formidable weapon into an almost untouchable legend of the Pacific War. But first, he had to convince them to do the one thing they were all trained to see as a death sentence: to understand how Lindbergh ended up thousands of miles from home, a man both celebrated and scorned. You have to go back to 1927. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a master of efficiency, a man obsessed with the mathematics of flight. When he flew the Spirit of St. Louis from New York to Paris, it wasn't just bravery. It was a 33-hour masterclass in fuel management. He landed in Paris with 85 gallons of fuel still in his tanks, enough to fly from Boston to Washington, D.C. Experts had said it was impossible. But for Lindbergh, impossible was just a problem he hadn't solved yet. This wasn't just a stunt. It was the foundation of a skill that, years later, would save countless American lives. However, the hero of the Atlantic became a deeply controversial figure in the years leading up to the war. His leadership in the America First Committee, arguing against involvement in the European conflict, put him in direct opposition to President Franklin Roosevelt. The clash was personal and public. After FDR compared him to a Civil War-era traitor, Lindbergh resigned his commission as a colonel in the Air Corps Reserve. So when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and America needed every skilled man it could find, Lindbergh wanted to serve. But the message from the White House was clear. Charles Lindbergh would not wear an American military uniform again. But a man of his talent couldn't be kept on the sidelines forever. The military might have closed the front door, but industry opened a window. Lindbergh became a civilian technical consultant, a sort of roving genius for aircraft manufacturers. He worked with the makers of the F-4U Corsair, teaching Marine pilots how to safely double their bomb loads, a trick that immediately increased their firepower and stopped the deadly takeoff accidents that had plagued the squadrons. Word began to spread through the Pacific. The famous Aviator was out here, a civilian in a war zone, solving problems that had left the top brass scratching their heads. We create stories like this one because we believe the ingenuity and courage of that generation should never be forgotten. If you feel the same way, taking a moment to subscribe helps us ensure these stories continue to be told. By mid-1944, Lindbergh's attention turned to the P-38 Lightning. It was a beast of a plane, fast, heavily armed, with two engines that gave pilots a precious sense of security over the unforgiving Pacific. But it had a fatal flaw. It was thirsty. The P-38 drank fuel at an alarming rate. Its operational range was a constant, nagging worry. Missions were planned down to the last gallon, leaving pilots with no margin for error. A little bit of unexpected weather, a slightly longer dogfight, and men were ditching their planes in the ocean, their chances of survival slim. This was the problem that drew Lindbergh to the 475th Fighter Group, known as Satan's Angels. They were one of the best P-38 outfits in the Pacific, and if he was going to solve the Lightning's drinking problem, this was the place to do it. And that's how he ended up at Colonel MacDonald's screen door, interrupting that game of checkers. At first, MacDonald was dismissive. He was a busy commander in the middle of a war. But Lindbergh had the quiet confidence of a man who knew something no one else did. He wasn't there to ask for favors. He was there to offer a solution. MacDonald, a sharp leader, sensed it. He invited Lindbergh to fly with them the very next day. The pilots were skeptical. Here was a 42-year-old civilian, a political outcast, wanting to fly into combat with men half his age. Major Thomas McGuire, already a top ace, was blunt. He wanted to see what the old guy could do. They didn't have to wait long. On his very first missions, Lindbergh's skill was obvious. His formation flying was flawless, sticking to his wingman's side as if they were connected by a wire. But it was what the ground crews discovered after the flights that started the whispers. After a 6.5-hour mission, other pilots would land with their fuel gauges hovering near empty, hearts in their throats. Lindbergh would land with 210 gallons to spare. It wasn't a fluke. It happened again and again. He was flying the same mission, in the same plane, through the same air, yet he was somehow stretching his fuel in a way that defied logic. The mystery didn't last long. MacDonald gathered his pilots in the rec hall under the glare of bare light bulbs and asked the civilian to explain his trick. Lindbergh stood before these seasoned combat aces and calmly told them that a core part of their training was wrong. The standard procedure for cruising in a P-38 was to run the engines at around 2,300 revolutions per minute, or RPM, with the fuel mixture set to auto-rich. This was the safe, by-the-book setting that kept the engines cool and delivered reliable power. But, Lindbergh explained, it was incredibly wasteful. He then laid out his method, and a nervous silence fell over the room. He told them to do the exact opposite of what they'd been taught. He said to dramatically lower the engine speed to just 1,600 RPM, lean out the fuel mixture, and then, here was the part that made their blood run cold, increase the manifold pressure. This technique was known to every pilot in the room as running over square. It was a cardinal sin of aviation, a practice they had been warned repeatedly would cause detonation, overheat the cylinders, and lead to catastrophic engine failure. It was, in short, a recipe for blowing your engines up mid-flight over hundreds of miles of open ocean. One pilot in the back of the room called the technique dangerous. Others just shook their heads. These were not rookies. They were men who had survived dozens of combat missions by trusting their training and their machines. Now this outsider was telling them to ignore it all. They were being asked to put their faith and their lives in the hands of a man who hadn't worn a uniform in years. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. For these pilots, the thought of a 9-hour mission was already a form of torture. The P-38 cockpit was cramped. They sat on their parachutes, and a survival raft was stuffed under that. 7 hours was already pushing the limits of human endurance. 9 hours sounded like a nightmare. But Colonel MacDonald saw something the others didn't. Lindbergh wasn't talking about theory. He had already been doing it. His plane hadn't fallen out of the sky. His engines hadn't blown up. And his fuel tanks told a story that was impossible to ignore. That extra fuel wasn't just a number, it was a lifeline. It meant more time over the target, more options in a dogfight, and a better chance of making it home if things went wrong. McDonnell made a command decision. They would test it, cautiously at first. The first pilots who tried it were on edge, listening for every new cough and sputter from their Allison engines. At the lower RPM, the familiar roar of the twin engines changed to a deeper, unfamiliar rumble. Every pilot's hand hovered near the controls, ready to switch back to the old settings at the first sign of trouble. But the trouble never came. The engine temperature gauges stayed in the green. Oil pressure held steady. In fact, the cylinder heads, the very things that were supposed to overheat and fail, actually ran cooler than they did with the old high RPM settings. Slowly, cautiously, the skepticism began to melt away, replaced by a growing sense of awe. The impossible was working. As they started using the technique on longer and longer missions, the results were staggering. The P-38's effective combat radius stretched from 570 miles to over 750 miles. That's like adding the distance from New York City to Cleveland to every single flight. They could now reach Japanese bases that had been untouchable, linger over the target for a precious 15 minutes to hunt for opportunities, and still return to base with a comfortable 1-hour fuel reserve. This wasn't just an improvement. It was a revolution. The whispers of doubt turned into buzz of excitement. Lindbergh wasn't just lecturing. He was leading by example, flying mission after mission. His call sign was simple: Mr. Lindbergh. He explained the physics in a way these practical men could understand. He told them that high RPM was like taking a lot of small, hurried steps. You burn a lot of energy for not much forward progress. His method was like taking long, powerful strides. Each combustion cycle in the engine was more efficient, using just enough fuel to do the job without waste. The fear of running over square was a misunderstanding of the principle. Yes, high manifold pressure could be dangerous at high power, but at the moderate cruise settings he was using, it was perfectly safe. He knew this because he'd spent thousands of hours in the air, from his solo Atlantic flight to his survey routes for Pan Am, treating every flight as a scientific experiment. He understood the soul of the machine. What gave him the confidence to try this in a P-38, a plane he'd only just learned to fly? The answer lay in the plane's two engines. Over the vast Pacific, losing an engine in a single-engine fighter like a Corsair or a Hellcat was almost always fatal. But the P-38 had a built-in safety net. If one engine failed, the other could get you home. Lindbergh saw this redundancy not just as a safety feature, but as a license to experiment, to push the envelope in a way no single-engine pilot would dare. He was making a calculated risk, and the payoff was changing the shape of the air war. By late July, the Lindbergh cruise technique was spreading like wildfire. What started with the 475th was now being adopted by other P-38 groups across the 5th Air Force. Commanders who had once been skeptical were now demanding to know how Satan's angels were getting so much more out of their planes. The impossible was quickly becoming the new standard. But Lindbergh's time in the Pacific wasn't just about teaching, it was about fighting. And on July 28, 1944, he found himself in a situation that no amount of fuel saving could solve. On a bomber escort mission, his flight encountered a lone Japanese reconnaissance plane, a Ki-51 Sonya. It should have been an easy kill. The Sonya was slow, clumsy, and lightly armed compared to the P-38, but its pilot, Captain Saburo Shimada, was a veteran, and he flew with a desperate courage that stunned the American aces. For 30 minutes, Shimada threw his plane across the sky, turning so tightly inside the faster P-38s that they couldn't get a clean shot. Tracers from multiple American fighters zipped past his tail as he twisted and dodged. He was putting on a master class in defensive flying, refusing to die easily. Then, in a move of sheer audacity, Shimada stopped running. He turned his plane head-on toward Lindbergh. The two aircraft hurtled toward each other at a closing speed of nearly 500 miles per hour. For a man who had faced storms over the Atlantic and political firestorms at home, this was a new kind of test. With no time to think, only to react, Lindbergh lined up the Sonya's engine in his gun sight and squeezed the trigger. For 6 solid seconds, the P-38's nose erupted in a torrent of cannon shells and .50 caliber bullets. He could see his rounds tearing into the Japanese plane, smoke pouring from its engine. But Shimada held his course. At the very last second, Lindbergh hauled back on the stick, his P-38 leaping over the Sonya, with only feet to spare. The crippled Japanese plane nosed over and plunged into the sea. Back at base, there was no official celebration. Multiple pilots had fired on the Sonya, but they all agreed. Lindbergh's head-on pass had delivered the fatal blow. Unofficially, he had just scored his first, and only, aerial victory of the war. But it would never be entered into the record books. A civilian shooting down an enemy plane would create a bureaucratic firestorm that could end his time in the Pacific. It was a secret the pilots of the 475th would keep. Just a few days later, the war almost claimed Lindbergh himself. During a dogfight with a nimble Japanese Zero, he found himself outmaneuvered. The Zero latched onto his tail, and for a terrifying moment, Lindbergh was the prey. Only a last-second warning from Colonel MacDonald. "Brake right, brake right," and MacDonald's own attack on the Zero saved his life. That close call was enough for the top command. Lindbergh had proven his point. He had flown around 50 combat missions, revolutionized fighter tactics, and even shot down an enemy plane. They had gotten more from the civilian consultant than they could have ever imagined. It was time to send him home before his luck ran out. When he left Hollandia in mid-August, the men of the 475th Fighter Group, the same men who had eyed him with suspicion just weeks before, gathered to see him off. He had arrived a controversial celebrity and was leaving as a respected comrade, a brother in arms who had fought alongside them and shared his knowledge freely. The impact of those 6 weeks was profound. By the time of the Philippines campaign in late 1944, P-38s were providing crucial air cover for MacArthur's landings from bases that would have been far out of range just months earlier. This wasn't just an abstract tactical advantage. It meant American soldiers on the beaches were protected from enemy air attacks. The ability to fly farther meant Allied planners could bypass heavily defended Japanese island fortresses, saving thousands of lives in bloody amphibious assaults. This ripple effect, starting from one man's insight, sped up the timeline for ending the war in the Pacific. It also had a very human impact. The extra fuel in the tanks became a precious safety margin. When a pilot's plane was shot up in combat, that extra hour of fuel could be the difference between bailing out over the ocean and making it back to a friendly airstrip. When a storm forced a long detour, it was no longer an automatic death sentence. Lives were saved, not just by the missions the P-38s could now fly, but by the ones they could now survive. Lindbergh had given them not just a longer reach, but a longer leash on life. It's remarkable how a small change can have such a huge effect, isn't it? If you've ever had a moment in your own life where a simple, impossible trick made all the difference, I'd be honored to read about it in the comments. It's in sharing these stories that we keep this kind of practical wisdom alive. Years later, the pilots of the 475th Men who had become legends in their own right still spoke of Lindbergh with a kind of reverence. They remembered the exact engine settings he had taught them, the numbers that had seemed so dangerous at first and had become their key to survival and victory. Major Richard Bong, America's ace of aces with 40 kills, said Lindbergh was as hot a pilot as any of us. High praise from a man who was the best of the best. In the end, Lindbergh's contribution wasn't about politics or fame. It was about competence. In the brutal meritocracy of aerial combat, where the only thing that matters is what you can do in the cockpit, he had proven himself beyond any doubt. After the war, his contributions were formally recognized, and his commission as a brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve was restored by President Eisenhower. But for Lindbergh, the true validation had already come in the skies over New Guinea. He had found a way to serve his country in its time of need, not as a soldier under orders, but as a master of his craft, sharing a gift that no one else possessed. The story of Charles Lindbergh and the P-38 is more than just a footnote in military history. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs don't come from a committee or a manual, but from a single, curious mind, willing to question the way things have always been done. It's about how one man's lifelong obsession with wringing every last mile from a gallon of fuel gave America's finest pilots the edge they needed to win the war in the Pacific. It proves that knowledge, when applied with courage, can be the most powerful weapon of all. We've explored some incredible history today, and if you're like me, one story just leads to another. The video you see on your screen right now is about another overlooked hero whose ingenuity changed the course of the war. Just click on that to continue the journey. And remember, subscribing is the best way to make sure you never miss these stories from our shared past. Thank you for your time and your attention.